I love using analogies because they're a great way of explaining things in a very non-condescending way. You meet the listener where they are, you use universal language, you tell a story, and you show that you care. How do you make an analogy? Well, here's my method. I'm reading this book and I came across this term called technical debt and I don't understand what it is. Let me ask my friend who's a programmer, maybe he can explain it to me. Technical debt is the implied cost of future refactoring, maintenance, and debugging caused by choosing suboptimal software development solutions over more thorough approaches. I still don't get it. I mean, that sounded like a lot of smart words, but they just flew over my head because you didn't use terms that I would understand. You're right. Sorry, let me try that again. So, technical debt, for example, when you're coding an app, is as if you're trying to build a skyscraper using cardboard boxes. Sure, you're much faster because you're skipping all the blueprints, all the steel beams, and in the beginning it's looking great. You're 10 times faster than the guys using steel. But here's the problem. Eventually you're going to want to add a 10th floor, and then when you do, the weight is going to start crushing the cardboard at the bottom. And then suddenly you're not building anymore, you're just taping the base and fixing so the whole thing doesn't fall over. This building has a lot of technical debt because you were cutting corners in the beginning, building fast and dirty, and now you spend all your time just fixing. The same thing can happen in coding too. Oh, now I get it. Loved your analogy because you explained a new term using everyday words that I understand, like cardboard and skyscraper, and you painted a very vivid story. Thanks for teaching me. As part of my duties as the creative one in my friend group, I use these types of analogies all the time, and my friends love them. They praise it as a superpower that I can explain complicated things in very simple terms. But it's not a superpower at all. It's a creative thinking method that you can follow. Great analogies stick to 7 intuitive steps. Let me walk you through them and I'll share another example so we can build it together step by step. And my favorite part is when you bring the analogy home and it lands so well. I'll show you how to do that too, so stick around. Here's how analogies are different from metaphors, allegories, and parables. A metaphor, the smallest one, is just an expression. It's raining cats and dogs. We know it's not, but that's how the saying goes. Analogy is when you're explaining a new term with an older one that people already know. A parable is a whole story with scenes and dialogue. It can have political commentary or a spiritual lesson. And an allegory is an even longer parable, usually like a full novel. Now that we know the differences, let's dive into the middle one. How do you make an analogy? Well, here's my method. Step 0 is always to ask yourself whether the person that you're talking to knows what the context is. If you're just starting the conversation, that means that they probably don't know what you're talking about. So it's good to share some general context like, oh, this is about programming or about biology. But if you're already deep into a conversation, you're good to go. Step 1 is to identify the core relationship that illustrates what you mean. So it's a relationship between a thing that you're trying to explain and another common thing that people usually understand. Let me explain this with an analogy of what the brain is. So a poor analogy would be to say, oh, the brain is like a walnut, they look the same. Sure, they do look the same and there is a connection, there's a relationship there, but it's not the core relationship. It's not illustrating what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that the brain is like a muscle. The more you put strain on it, the stronger it gets. The key here is not to look at what the brain is, but what the brain does. Limit yourself to things that everybody understands. Things like cooking, driving, parenting, or natural things like gravity, water, or fire. Step 3 is to match the stakes. That means that if you're describing a high-pressure corporate merger, don't compare it to, oh, it's just like trading sandwiches at lunch, because the emotional weight doesn't match the gravity of the situation. Instead, you can compare it to, oh, it's just like two kingdoms coming together, uniting to fight a common enemy. That sounds much better. Step 4 is to choose where you want things to fall. Do you want them to fall into place or do you want them to fall apart? Both can work for you depending on what you're going for, what you're trying to illustrate. For example, our brain is a muscle analogy fell beautifully into place because both the brain and the muscle they have the same characteristics. They grow stronger under pressure, just like diamonds. Never mind. I got sidetracked. Here's an example of a great analogy that works because the two things don't match and they fall apart. Let's say that you're trying to give somebody advice and that person just not ready to hear it, or they refuse to change. That happens. The analogy goes, me giving you this advice right now is as if I'm giving you the most high-tech waterproof hiking boots in the world while you're in the middle of a lake drowning. The boots are objectively great at keeping your feet dry, but they're not helpful at this moment because they're just adding to the weight that's pulling you down. First, we need to get you to the shore, and then we can talk about your footwear. Step 5 is to check for leakage. Every analogy falls apart no matter how well you craft it, but you can rely on it to be airtight for a very specific point that you're trying to make. Here's an example. If you say the internet is like a highway, it works for illustrating traffic and speed, but it starts breaking down if you start talking about internet potholes or paving the internet, because these things just don't translate very well into the internet world. But if you try hard enough, you can see how far you can stretch these and get away with it. A great analogy ends with a satisfying click when the logic lands and the light bulb appears over the person's head. Step 6 is to nail that landing with an explanatory hook. To find your hook, ask yourself what is the exact moment where this analogy either fails or it gets a superpower. In our skyscraper analogy, the point of failure is the 10th floor, but in our brain is a muscle analogy, it gets a superpower when it starts acting as a muscle, you train it and it gets stronger. The hook helps you drive your point home, and without it, the other person is left all alone, confused, and they have to finish your analogy in their own heads. And that might take a wrong turn. For example, if you say, oh, starting a business is like growing a garden, and then you stop there, they might be like, so that means that it's dirty business, that you need to prune the weeds, or maybe you're just supposed to start a business in the springtime because that's when you garden. No, that really doesn't make sense. So use your hook to guide their thinking throughout the whole thing. So in this garden example, starting a business is like a garden. You invest a lot in the beginning, so it's like sowing the seeds, and then with enough work and with enough patience, you see the results later and they bloom into a beautiful flower. That was a pretty long framework, but the good news is most of these things come to you very intuitively. It's still good to know how the system works, because once you know the anatomy of a good analogy, you then know what to look out for when you're building one. And when you know the steps where you're rusty, just give them a little bit extra love and you'll be fine. Let's build a great analogy and then break it down into all the steps. We can do this very quickly. Our friend who's 20 years old, they think that saving 50 euros a month is not a lot because that's only 600 euros a year. And you're trying to illustrate the power of compound interest. The core relationship here is not adding money, but it's actually growth stacking on more growth. That means that you're not only earning interest on the money that you put in, but you're also earning interest on the interest that you've already earned. So when you translate that, it's just like a big snowball rolling down a long snowy hill. Everyone understands that as it rolls, it gets bigger because of the increased surface area is grabbing more snow with every rotation. Since we're talking about a very high stakes situation, possibly financial freedom until the rest of their lives, we're not using a small scale analogy, oh, it's just like a snowball fight. No, we're going big. We're making this about a huge mountain-sized boulder that's rolling and it's unstoppable by the time it reaches the bottom of the hill. This analogy falls into place because the physics of the snowball and the math of the compound interest have very similar characteristics. They both have a slow start, they have acceleration, and they both have momentum. A snowball can hit a tree or it can melt, and in finance that will translate into a market crash or inflation. However, our analogy still holds as long as we focus on the momentum. The leak here would be if we started saying that the snowball is cold, and that has nothing to do with compound interest. Compound interest is like rolling a snowball down a mountain. In the beginning, you're doing all the work just to keep it moving, but once it gains momentum, it starts doing the work for you. And by the time it reaches the foot of the hill, it's so big that in a single rotation, it grabs more snow than you could have shoveled by hand in a lifetime. Here's why this works. The person quickly realizes that the work of saving money eventually stops being the primary driver of the size of the snowball and the wealth, and the momentum takes over. The long hill represents the time, and the snow represents the interest. Congrats! Now you know the anatomy of a great analogy, and I look forward to that satisfying moment when you land your next analogy and get that satisfying, oh. One note though, in step 2, speaking in universally understood terms, you're supposed to limit your areas of what you're talking about to things that people understand. That's a form of creative constraints, and creative constraints are a creativity technique that's super powerful because it helps you think more creatively by limiting the number of options that you have. It's the most viewed creative demo video on the channel to date, and that means that all the weirdos are recommending it to you. So the next step on your learning journey is to check out and master creative constraints.